How's it going, everybody? Greg here, of Gregarious Media. Welcome to the pilot week of Discog Devil, where we go over an artist a week with 3 videos. We go over the worst to best albums in their discography, the worst to best tracks of the last release, and a discussion video. So without further ado, let's begin with System of a Down. Now, I start off with System of a Down knowing that I have a bit of a bias. I am a huge fan of System of a Down. I do enjoy all of their albums. And they also have 5 albums, so this makes a countdown like this much easier to do. For those who don't know System of a Down, they're an alternative metal band based out of California who started in the mid-90s as Soil, but later changed their name to System of a Down. And Soil ends up being track number 7 on their debut album. Fun fact. System of a Down got their big breakthrough in the 2000s with their album Toxicity, with big hits such as Chop Suey, Toxicity, and Aerials being massive in the early 2000s. And they continue to have big singles ever since. Now, the last album that System of a Down released was Hypnotized back in 2005. They have confirmed that they have new material in the works, but unfortunately none of them can really compromise as to what that sound is going to be for their next album if it ever comes out. So for now, this episode is going to consist of their 5 albums that they've released thus far. Let's begin. Unfortunately, since I do have to put one of these 5 albums at the bottom, even though I do enjoy all of them, the one I'd have to put down here at number 5 is Steal This Album. This album was kind of known as Toxicity 2 because a lot of the songs on here, or the demos of these songs, were leaked. So a lot of these on this album are reworkings or reproductions and remasterings of those demos, and plus a few other originals that weren't leaked either. Now, there are some fantastic songs in here, and I want to go over those first, just to get some of the positives out here, because it's not like putting this album at the bottom means that there aren't any good qualities at all. In fact, I think some of the deep cuts on here are some of System of a Down's best work. You have the triple knockout from track 6 to 8 being ADD, Mr. Jack, and IAIAIO being just triple hit after hit after hit. And then you also have Streamline at the end of this album, which I think is a completely underrated cut and one that kind of gets a bit overlooked. And not to mention Ego Brain and Roulette were also some fantastic ones on here. However, when it comes to the overall quality of all the songs, while I do find a lot of them good, and even those moments that are great on this album, there's a lot that doesn't quite match up to System's best work. Every track from 1 to 5 is very short, and while good, they're not great. It does lead into the ADD, Mr. Jack, and IAIAIO triple threat that I mentioned earlier, but then it leads into the shortest song, which is 36, and which I understand goes into the trio of songs being 36, Pictures, and Highway Song, but 36 on its individual merits doesn't really have anything to it. Pictures, I think, has a killer bass line and killer rhythm section. It's just really fucking short. And then Highway Song, I think, is really good. Fuck the System, I think, is also really good, but it's also a little bit too short, in my opinion. On this album, I think they could have done just a little bit more with some of these songs, because a lot of them are very short. And which I know that with every System of a Down album, there's always 1 or 2 short songs. But on this one, there's just a collection of short ones that I think, if were fleshed out just a little bit more, would have added up to a fantastic album. This is still a good album, but it's not as great as the ones before or the ones that came after. So the key 3 tracks I'd recommend from this album would be ADD, Mr. Jack, and Streamline. At number 4 on my list, I gotta go with Mesmerized, the first album of 2, released in 2005. Now, this album does have some big classics under its belt. BYOB, Cigarro, Question are all fantastic songs. And I'd even say Violent Pornography is probably one of my favorite songs on here. In fact, my old band, 6 Feet to Heaven, which is the band that I used for the intro for this video, we actually covered Violent Pornography at a couple shows, and it was fucking fun. This album is their shortest, clocking in at just over 30 minutes, and with 11 tracks, but one of which being Soldier Side intro, being kind of more like a 1-minute teaser to what would eventually be a full closing track on the follow-up album Hypnotized, was good, and which was a nice lead-in to BYOB. Then you have tracks like This Cocaine Makes Me Feel Like I'm on This Song, which clocks in just barely over 2 minutes, and Old School Hollywood is just a little too repetitive for me, even though they actually do change the verses up a little, which is something that they don't often do on some of these songs. Now, I do enjoy a lot in this album, and I do think it's has some of System of a Down's best work. Unfortunately, just like Steal This Album, there are some that unfortunately feel a little bit like filler. This Cocaine Makes Me Feel Like I'm on This Song. I think Sad Statue was good, but not up to System's best. Old School Hollywood, I think, was just a little bit too much of this disco metal type of thing, which sounds okay, but Darren's vocals on it were definitely not his best performance. And Lost in Hollywood, I think, is a really good closer, and I do like the more mellow approach that it ends off with, considering how pretty aggressive this album is overall as a whole. But kind of following up Old School Hollywood doesn't quite make it as good. I think if Old School Hollywood was scrapped and this followed Sad Statue, I think it might have sounded a little better as a closer. As an individual song, it's fine on its own. But again, I wouldn't put it up there with System's best work. Despite all the negatives I just kind of threw out there, this is definitely one of System's catchiest albums. And once you play it front to back, you're going to remember a lot of these songs just right off on first listen. If you haven't heard it already, do check this album out. The key three from this album would be BYOB, Cigarro, and Violent Pornography. Was at number 3 on this list, we got Hypnotized, the second release in 2005 by System of a Down. This album does build where Mesmerized left off. The lyricism on this album is a little bit more straightforward and blunt, which is kind of where Mesmerized was starting to go as well, whereas the previous albums had a little more cryptic and kind of abstract sort of approaches. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think for a lot of these songs, it just makes it even catchier and more direct. But with some of the songs like Lonely Day, for example, it just gets repetitively annoying. And I like a lot of the vocal contributions that Darren has on this album. Lonely Day is just one of the single most annoying songs. I think if not the most annoying song the System of a Down has ever recorded, and is easily one of their worst tracks, I think. While the solo on it is unquestionably fantastic, everything leading up to it is not. Other songs on this album, like Kill Rock and Roll and Hypnotize, were much more straightforward, which I think were good, but unfortunately didn't have that left hook kind of approach that System is known for. Even Steal This Album on some of their shorter songs still had that System left hook style of metal, where here it decides to go a little bit more to a more straightforward alternative rock with a metallic kind of edge to it, which works, but aren't the most enjoyable moments. However, the highlights on this album, I think, are just as good, if not even surpass Mesmerized. And yes, I know, surpassing BYOB is kind of a tough thing, but hear me out. The extremely thrashy moments on this album are just fantastic. And then you have Holy Mountains, which is one of the juggernauts of System's catalog that just can't be beat. You also have the full version of Soldier Side, which was originally just an intro on Mesmerize, and which I think closes this album on this really dramatic, really dark, but fantastically beautiful note. And the weirder moments on this album just show how weird that System could still go. With You Fig, Vicinity of Obscenity, and She's Like Heroin, all sounding extremely quirky, thrashy, off the wall, that Mesmerize had some of, but not quite to that point. You had moments like Cigarro, but on here, it's just much more blatantly weird. The strong points on this album are very high. Unfortunately, there's the extremely low point of Lonely Day, and I think the more straightforward songs, while they are good, unfortunately stick out like sore thumbs. However, it's still a fantastic album. It has some of System's best work, and considering that this is the last album that System has released so far, and it still holds up this well to this day, I'd say that says something. In which I don't even know if my previous sentence just said anything. The key three I'd recommend from this album are Dreaming, Holy Mountains, and Soldier Side. At number 2 on this list, you knew that Toxicity had to be in the top 3. Toxicity is at my number 2. So this was the big breakout album for System, with singles such as Chop Suey, Toxicity, and Aerials being massive on rock radio back when rock radio actually fucking meant something. The opener Prison song on this album just showcases their weird, bizarre, but brutal sound. And it just doesn't let up from there. You have Needles, Deer Dance, Jet Pilot, X, Chop Suey. It's just really a non-stop thrash marathon up until you hit about Ottawa in track 9. Even Forest is still heavy as fuck. But then you get to Ottawa, in which then goes right into Science, Shimmy, Toxicity, and then gets a little more mellow with Psycho, and then Aerials / Arto finishes it off. There really is so much about this album that I love. The reason that Toxicity, I think, resonates so much is that the weirdness, while it's still accessible, arguably accessible, it's still not like any other album that you've heard. Really, you can make that argument with almost any System album, but Toxicity in particular just somehow has this classic feel to it that you can hear so many other bands take influence from this album, but you've never heard anyone try to duplicate this album. This album just holds its own still since 2001. This album's fucking 17 years old as of recording this video. Or it's going to be 17 because it hasn't hit the exact month or whatever. For people who are a little bit weary on metal music, this is usually an album that they check out and go, oh, I like metal music now. Because this is weird. It still holds the key elements that make a metal album, but it adds so many other musical qualities to it that it makes the metal just a little bit more accessible for someone who isn't as familiar. But at the same time, it's still so bizarre that some like pure metalheads will think that this album is pure shit. But to lump this in with a bunch of different other new metal bands would kind of do this injustice. I understand that this album came out during like the new metal wave, and this does have much more of a groove-oriented sound. But no album during that time sounded like this. And no album after this, from my understanding, or from my experience, has ever replicated sort of the feel that this album brings. The key 3 from this album are Prison Song, Science, and Aerials. On to the grand finale of this list of top 5, the worst to best. We're at the best. And if you haven't fucking guessed it by now, it's their debut album. System's self-titled 1999 release is still one of the roughest and most bizarre fucking metal albums I've ever heard from top to bottom, and I still love every goddamn second of this thing. The opener, Sweet Pea, is just this bizarre guitar noodling that just explodes in your face. And it just doesn't let up. The rhythms on this album, the weird tempo shifts and song structure changes are just so bizarre still. That's like, who the fuck could create something like this? The reason I have the debut over Toxicity on this list is because while I still love Toxicity front to back, I think the weirdness and kind of bizarre twist that System of a Down takes to metal is much more unhinged on the debut. And the production being just a little more rough adds this just even crazier quality to all the tracks on here. Sugar! The massive fucking song on here. You also have other songs such as Soil, Pluck, War, the longest song that they've ever recorded at 6.5 minutes, Mind, which starts off with this dark, almost jazzy kind of feel that then just explodes. While it doesn't have as much Darren in the vocals, outside of a couple little back vocal parts here and there, Surge is just at his most animalistic on this album. From the high, quirky, yelping, almost cartoonishly absurd vocals to the dark fucking gutturals that he's able to reach that still sound like the most brutal fucking lows I've ever heard. And then his singing on every track here, it's like flawless. So System's Self-Titled is one of my favorite albums ever, and to kind of go over every single track would make this video way too fucking long, because there's not a single one on here that I wouldn't recommend. But I guess if I have to go with a key 3 on this album: No, Soil, and Pluck. So thank you everyone for watching. Stay tuned for a worst to best tracks of Hypnotized. Will be out later this week, and potentially a discussion video if I can find the time. Like, comment, subscribe, follow social media. You know the whole YouTube shtick, drill, yada yada yada. Thank you again. I'll see you next video. Goodbye.